Hello and welcome to today's broadcast. I'm Davina and I'm an American resident from Australia, as you may be able to tell by my accent. And oh, I have family. Uh, I have family that survived the Holocaust. Hence, today's subject of the broadcast, as well as the general theme of these broadcasts being part of an effort to throw pebbles in a pond to protect democracy and to hope that, however small the pebble, that the ripples will make concentric circles that inspire other people to throw their pebbles in the pond as well. As some of you who have followed me for a while may know, I am a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, and it's an interesting story as well as being a very personal story for my family, that my grandmother, when she was 16 years old, was on a train with her parents, was forced to go on a train to a death camp, Belzec specifically, and there was a hole in the train carriage, and her parents insisted that my grandmother jump through the hole and get off the train that way. And she protested and didn't want to go and wanted to stay with her parents. So she wanted to stay with her parents, but they insisted she go, and so she did. And so they proceeded to the camp and were killed, and she escaped with her life. She was at one point arrested by the Russian army under suspicion of being a German spy, because she could speak German as well as Polish, but she recited portions of the Jewish holy text, the Torah, and was so able to convince them that she was Jewish and on the run, and consequently not a German spy. So I'm also running a Twitter space at the same time. So we'll see how this works and whether or not I can share. What if I tick? And then I've got somebody else who might be able to contribute as well. They're just connecting. Well, that's going to be an interesting experiment. So anyway, kudos to my grandmother. Hello, person I've just accepted as a speaker. Oh, you've muted yourself. Well, that's good. You can continue to listen. Hello.
Hello. I'm just listening to what you speak.
Oh, good.
I'm not good at English.
Oh, okay. No, well, that's fine. Yes, if you turn your microphone back off, then that will reduce the static from you. But thank you for joining in the space, and thank you for listening. That's much appreciated.
I'm trying to understand your subject, Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Correct. That is the subject.
In Germany, Holocaust, Jesus Holocaust.
Yes, the World War II Holocaust. That is trending today because it is the day set aside in the global calendar for remembering the events of the Holocaust.
Yeah. I'm just listening. I am not good at English. You can speak.
Okay, yes. But I'm just requesting also that, hang on, if I mute your microphone, that'll get rid of the static in the background, because I'm simultaneously running a broadcast, a live stream as well. So hello, Bob, my faithful viewer there. So anybody who joins the Twitter space or the live broadcast will be able to engage. Was telling the story that my grandmother made it through, was able to evade recapture by the Nazis, and have a family, marry my grandfather in Poland, and eventually immigrate to Australia with an 11-year-old daughter who was my mother. And she would use her rich experiences to encourage her grandchildren to focus on their education. And she would tell us, my brother and I, the Nazis tried to take my life but they couldn't take my knowledge. And it wasn't an argument that had any resonance with me as a small child because I didn't really understand. As an adult, I can understand that she was describing education as something that endured, and it was something that gave her dignity even when people were murdering her family members, even when they were completely controlling the environment, that she still had a rich inner life, and she had the knowledge of her accomplishments to sustain her and to sustain her conviction that she was not subhuman in the way that Nazis described her, as Nazis described in general Jewish people. So yes, today, Holocaust Awareness, Holocaust Remembrance Day is important to me because I see a repeat of certain trajectories and tendencies. And many people I've been heartened to see have also noted these similarities and noted that elements of human nature are useful in some ways as protective characteristics. We can listen to each other and put our faith and trust in each other and say, oh, you've identified a threat, well, I'll trust you and believe you, and we can unify in opposition to that threat, and collectively we are stronger as a consequence. And when you have unconscionable populistic liars who manage to achieve high public office, who bamboozle enough people and intimidate enough other people to get their own way, they are able to weaponize that element of human nature. They are able to weaponize the fact that people will enjoy feeling a sense of common purpose, that it will light up our dopamine centers if we find someone who we put our trust in and who we believe. And if we unify together against a threat. So Hitler was able to build on people's suspicion, rightful suspicion of communism as being a method of governance that lends itself to corruption and authoritarianism. And he built on that by and built on a pre-existing level of anti-Semitism in European countries and many countries where Jewish people are often visibly different if they're practicing Jews who adopt certain types of religious garb. And those visual identifiers can lend themselves to people identifying them as the other, not of us, not standard Germans. We can scapegoat them as a minority group and pretend that they are subhuman and worthy of scorn and derision and contempt and legalized forms of persecution. Hitler made people feel powerful as he escalated oppressive laws against to harm and demoralize Jewish people, forbidding them to own businesses, forbidding them to own weapons, forbidding them to, I need a new preposition for that. Making it illegal, how about that, for Jewish people to own property, to be employed in certain occupations, and ratcheting up the exclusionary terms. So Trump, within 6 days of coming to office, had instituted a Muslim ban, a ban for travel and for refugees to be accepted to America from, I think, 8 different specific countries with Muslim majority populations. None of the Muslim majority countries with which his company did business, but selectively other Muslim countries. Now, to people who had already been saying Trump sounds like a fascist, someone who is able to emotionally manipulate a segment of the population around the shared omnipotence of hating in unison, hating Mexicans in unison, in concert, giving in to the basest impulse of stigmatizing other people because of their membership in an ethnic minority. Oh, Bob said a beautiful thing. Bob said, "You exist because your grandmother." This is a good one. I'm going to have a sip of tea. You exist because your grandmother was brave. And I think she was a hero. Yes. That's a very beautiful thing to say, Bob. Thank you. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. So, yes, it would be nice if I could thank her for that. But I can't thank her for being brave right now because she passed away a few years ago. But she did live to attain a fairly significant age. She died when she was, I think, 86 years old. I don't know her age for sure. And she died with Alzheimer's, which was really scary, but okay for me, from the perspective, merely the personal perspective of worrying that she would spend her final years revisiting the past. Because that does happen to some people who escaped concentration camps or who escaped Nazi imprisonment. They regress into those periods of their life when they were living in hunger and fear. And that didn't appear to be the case for my grandmother. She didn't appear to be reminiscing about her experiences in the Holocaust. She instead would speak simple phrases in English when I saw her, and would smile and be very happy to see visitors, and would say the same phrase over and over again. She would say, "I am happy when you are happy." Yes, Bob says she knew you loved her, and as a grandpa, that to me is enough. Well, thank you, Bob. Yes, that is a good thing to remember. She did know she knew I loved her. Ha. You could just see her and you could take her photos and just show her people smiling. When my grandfather tried to do that, he took her some photos and she saw a photo of him with another woman and she was angry. She was like, see? And he was like, this is, the wife of my boss when I worked for this company. Don't you remember? He was an electrical engineer who traveled a lot. And so clearly she had this lurking element of jealousy, which was either activated or brought into being by Alzheimer's. But yes, she didn't say much about that. But Grandpa explained to her that, yes, the woman in the photo with him was the wife of a colleague. Somebody says, you are brave as well, ophthalmologist, which possibly means you're an ophthalmologist. That seems the most logical explanation. And says, we are strongest together. That is absolutely the case. And thank you for saying that too. I've got a lovely crowd of people today. We are stronger together. That was Hillary Clinton's campaign mantra, and it's got a lot of truth to it, particularly when you can see escalating fascist tendencies around the world. Hungary has anti-Semitic fascist Viktor Orban in leadership as the president there. And Tucker Carlson is traveling to Hungary in order to do a special, and I guess continue to sell the idea that Putin and his allies in Hungary and Belarus, Lukashenko, what's the president of Belarus's name? He was very brutal to protesters who protested in the streets, claiming that the election had been rigged in Belarus. And yes, the world is just sort of waiting with fingers crossed at the moment, because the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said, chill, don't worry. At the moment, Russians don't have a significant force amassed on the border to mount a full-scale invasion. So fingers crossed it works out. Russia, France, the UK and US representatives are still meeting to basically see if the world can come up with enough severe sanctions against Russia to deter Putin from living his dream of sabotaging emerging democracies around him, in order to keep it from the Russian people that the USSR ain't coming back under Vladimir Putin's leadership in any case, and that you can't just absorb the democracies around you in your effort to sustain a narrative that Russia has the perfect form of governance and that true democracies aren't possible or desirable. That's why Putin's always trying to sabotage the West, because he needs to at least have an argument to spin to his people that there are downsides to democracy and the West are hypocrites and imperfect. And there's a kernel of truth to that, because people aren't perfect and democracies are imperfect. And America's democracy certainly has significant problems at the moment, one of which was the Citizens United decision by a majority Supreme Court in 2010 that allowed for billionaire donations to, I think, quadruple in the years since that time. Bob's noting that Sweden and Finland have sent troops to Ukraine. That's excellent. And I think Joe Biden was going to give $500 million worth of military aid to Ukraine as well, which of course reminds me of the time when Congress approved, I think, $400 million worth of military aid to Ukraine in 2018 or 19, probably 2019. And then Donald Trump delayed that aid, which was a breach of his executive powers, but he delayed it whilst he sent his emissaries, Rudy Giuliani, his personal lawyer, and William Barr, his personal AG. Well, the United States AG, who was functioning as a personal attorney general for Donald Trump, to talk to various emissaries for the Ukrainian president, the newly elected former comedian and actor Vladimir Zelensky, and tell him, sure, we'll come through with that aid you're expecting, that military aid, which is to help protect your border against Russian incursions, given that Russia's already invaded and taken over Crimea in 2014, which is part of Ukraine, and the Donbass region. And yeah, Trump withheld that aid, delayed the aid, so that he could say, yeah, sure, it's coming any day now, but we need you to do us a favor. We need, and what he got Rudy Giuliani to say was essentially that if Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to doing a televised interview with a CNN reporter, Fareed Zakaria, who wasn't in on Donald Trump's ideas, but so it would have had the appearance of a legitimate interview. Just the CNN journalist wouldn't have had any idea of the duress and the compulsion of the withheld aid behind the scenes. The fact that Ukrainians would have been exposed to additional violence and danger from Russia without the promised military aid from the US, but that Trump was basically holding the lives of random Ukrainians hostage until Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to go on a live interview with Fareed Zakaria and say, yes, we're going to investigate Joe Biden's son. And that was the terms of the agreement. So Trump, like all good mobsters, was able to say, use language in a circumspect way to say, oh yes, we hear that there's lots of things that need investigating, so all you have to do is just agree to talk about these investigations, which definitely need to happen because Joe Biden's definitely corrupt. And then Trump can say, read the transcript, it's all above board, and I'm not ashamed of anything I've said. He doesn't even say I'm not ashamed of anything I've said. He knows not to even introduce the word shame into his utterances. He just says, it was perfect. Lots of people think it was perfect. There's never been a better phone call. Yes, so that was what happened when Trump was impeached, because a CIA whistleblower leaked the content of that conversation and leaked what was happening, that Trump was pressuring the president of an allied country and purposefully and unlawfully delaying a congressional apportionment of funding of military aid to Ukraine. Yeah, good times. So here we are again, at the mercy to a degree of Vlad the Impaler Putin, who probably likes the attention of us talking about him. That's what I've learned from watching Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. They like it when we all talk about them. But at least the least we can do is call Vladimir pathetic and say it is pathetic that he needs to deceive his citizens and to deceive Russians that Russian governance is so great, and to distract them from the way in which he funnels off a portion of profits from various industries in Russia to line his own pockets rather than putting those funds towards the collective use of his people. So, building better infrastructure for the Russian people, strengthening the Russian economy, doing anything actually as a leader instead of as a manipulative, demagogic dictator who has eliminated distance between the state and the media. So the media doesn't appropriately critique Vladimir Putin, the media of Vladimir Putin's hype boys. And Russian media are very excited about what a great job Tucker Carlson is doing in terms of convincing Republicans in America that Putin is reasonable, the West should acquiesce to his demands, that NATO should promise to never admit Ukraine and should promise to withdraw US troops from various European countries. Coincidentally, Trump had already begun to withdraw US troops from bases in European countries. He had withdrawn US troops from some bases in Germany. So let's just go back to a topical issue for a moment and note that on Holocaust Remembrance Day, reporting has escalated about what happened at a school board in Tennessee, because a Tennessee school board with a 10-0 vote, so all in favor of banning a Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about the Holocaust, in which a man wrote a story, drew pictures for a story in which Jewish people are characterized as mice, in a satire of the way in which Nazis sought to dehumanize Jews in Germany and in Europe more broadly as vermin, as being less than human, as being worthy of extermination, because extermination is what you do to vermin, and it's made easier. You can more easily gain the acquiescence of the public if you first spend years belittling Jewish people collectively and describing them as vermin and as enemies of the state. It takes a lot of psychological road to travel along before you have not only acquiescence but also active endorsement for a program of mass murder. Now, so when this Tennessee school board unanimously voted to remove Maus, the graphic novel Maus, from the literacy program for Year 8 students, it wasn't a history being studied as a history textbook. It was part of the English curriculum. And the board members discussed, because I read some of the notes, no, not as a primary source, I read somebody writing about the notes from the meeting. They were concerned that there were instances of swear words, and there was also a small picture of female nudity, because the author's mother, who was a survivor of the Holocaust and specifically of a concentration camp, took her own life when the author was a young boy. So there was a tiny illustration of a woman in a bath, because that is a biographical detail from the author's life, which is featured in the novel. So it's true, it would not be an easy novel to read for Year 8 students or for anybody. I have consequently bought it because of the reporting on this ban. So I've ordered it, a secondhand copy that's going to be sent to my house. I've avoided reading it because I've read a lot of Holocaust literature and it's kind of burdensome to deal with. But you've got to do the work. You've got to do the work. You've got to put in the effort to avoid these things happening going forwards. Oh, somebody else joined the Twitter space. Maybe I'll say hi. I can't wave at them. Oops. But I can do a little fist pump. There we go. To show that I notice their presence. Bob says he has an off-subject comment, but on one of my broadcasts, you'd like to hear my thoughts on the US school system compared to other countries because your grandsons are homeschooled. Oh, well, I can, for sure, center a broadcast around the topic of homeschooling and the school system and give my observations on that. But for now, yes, I'll return to this, which is I hope there's enough backlash against that Tennessee school board decision that more people order the graphic novel Maus, and more people are prepared to stand up at school board meetings and counter the growing conservative impetus to ban books for being contentious, for possibly containing a swear word or two, but really they're worried about discomfort. They're worried about the discomfort occasioned by anybody who looks boldly at history. And if you don't ever challenge your comfort level, if you don't ever look at history, because history is full of uncomfortable things for everybody, but particularly for white people who've done quite a lot of the colonizing and pillaging in recent centuries, and oppressing and enslaving. Yes, there's going to be discomfort. And something I haven't read yet, but is on my reading list for today, is called The Sacred Work of White Discomfort. Let's see if I can find that. The man who wrote it is named Robert P. Jones. He's a former Baptist, I think. And he wrote a book called White Too Long, which I shall try and borrow from the library, actually, an indispensable study of Christianity in America. Okay. So, this is on Substack, and it's been noted today that anti-vaxxers are earning millions of dollars writing disinformation on Substack, and the founders responded tangentially to criticism by writing their own blog post about how they think it's really important to build trust in the media by airing views that are contentious. And it's like, we're in a pandemic still, 3,600 people are dying a day still in America. That's where we're at the moment. 3,685 people approximately are dying each day. So it's not just contentious views. If you give a platform to anti-vaxxers, you are just randomly signing the death certificates of thousands of people who will absorb that information, who are primed to believe it already by a former president who already told people to distrust authorities on the subject of COVID, that it was an overblown drama confected in order to discredit him as president and in order to make him look bad. So a lot of Trump loyalists who've been fed a steady diet of lies for years, a steady diet of antagonistic, oppositionally defiant lies for years, together with the naturalistic fallacies of some on the left or on any side of the political spectrum, actually, who are immersed in the idea of natural health pursued by devoting yourself to rejecting mainstream medicine. And that can extend to rejecting mainstream vaccinations during a time of pandemic, which means unnecessarily exposing yourself to danger, unnecessarily increasing your risk profile of contracting a disease that in many instances leaves people with long-term disabilities. And it's not known yet how long those disabilities may exist, but people have been left with disabling levels of fatigue, brain fog, increased risk of contracting diabetes and Parkinson's disease, and kidney dysfunction, etc. So let's have a look at what Robert P. Jones wrote. I can share on screen what he said. Bob thinks that book is in my local library. Which book, Bob? The White Too Long? Because I hope so. Okay, so I'm not Christian, and in fact, I'm a secular Jew, but I'm reading this item by a Christian because the way to affirm the truth of never again, which is something that Jews often say with regard to the Holocaust, never again, eternal vigilance, etc., don't allow charismatic demagogues to ever whip up a population into a fervor over cohating on disdained minority groups, or minority groups where there's already high levels of racism or stigma against people who belong to that demographic cohort. So here we go. Robert P. Jones wrote, "If we, white Christians, can muster the courage to walk in its company, discomfort with our racial history can be a sacred and saving gift." It's titled The Sacred Work of White Discomfort. Hang on, gotta turn the light on. All right, thank you to the Black Lives Matter listener who joined me on the Twitter space as well. Thank you so much. All right, got a little bit more light. How are we going? All right, sacred work of white discomfort. White people have to do this. There's a bill in Florida trying to make it illegal to have any topics in educational systems that potentially cause white discomfort. And he also says he wrote about the value of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s hard words for white Christians. That's good. Hard words for white Christians. Okay, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "The Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. And those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like the waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." So that's a good thing and very relevant. And he also wrote, "When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be amongst our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. I've heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshippers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law, but I have longed to hear white ministers declare, follow this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the middle of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular. So there you go. I have just been reading aloud some words from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about how people hid behind the comfort of stained glass windows. And that's also what I imagine many German people doing, because it would have been inconvenient to oppose Hitler. And in fact, there's a book called They Thought They Were Free, in which an American journalist traveled to Germany and interviewed people about what was going through their head during the rise of the Third Reich, during Nazism, during the Holocaust, and what preceded the Holocaust. And many of them said that things did seem wrong to them, but it felt like, oh, now is not the moment to speak up, or I'm waiting for other people to speak up. Will I just be by myself if I say anything, and it won't be any use anyway? So really, every voice that speaks up against escalating injustice is key to empowering others, to drawing a permission structure for others to speak up. So this is why it's critical for all of us to acquaint ourselves with what is happening to undermine, to white ant democracy in the United States right now, without a great deal of public attention. It is the Republican efforts to wind back ease of voting access, to pass legislation that makes drop-off ballot boxes illegal, that makes it illegal to hand out food or water to people who've waited in line for a long time to vote in Georgia counties, and to make voting by mail illegal, to do all sorts of things to make it more difficult for people who maybe work multiple jobs to be able to vote. Republican politicians who previously supported drop boxes at state level are now anti it. And in fact, there's an article I want to share. I'm going to unmute the microphone on my Twitter space so that if that person wants to join me, you can. But I'll just leave that there. So person who's listening on Twitter space, if you want to join your voice in to this conversation, I can invite you to speak if you want. There you go. I sent an invite. Oh yes, an article about what's happening to the Republican Party in Wisconsin. Oh, and I'm going to take a moment to celebrate that Supreme Court Justice Breyer is retiring, and that Biden has confirmed that he's following through with his campaign promise from the primary elections in 2019, that he will appoint the first Black woman to the Supreme Court bench. And there are many qualified candidates. And so, yes, a lot of racists are taking their hoods off a little bit today to say, well, a Black lady isn't going to be as good, and it's racist to make up for the imbalances that currently exist on the court and that have historically existed because Black women have been excluded from the court. First of all, all women were excluded, and then Black women were excluded because they weren't considered as candidates. And when you willfully, when it's part of the status quo, to only include men and then to only include white women or even Latino women, but too much of a threat to conservative politicians, even conservative-leaning Democrats, to challenge people's conceptions of who deserves to have authority by allowing a Black woman, the most marginalized, discriminated against demographic in the United States, because of the compounding effect of not only racism, but racism compounded by sexism, to have a president who is committed to doing something to redress that by having a woman of color who will be able to relate to the travails of Black women in America, as well as to have that additional commitment to American democracy, the ideals of American democracy, because they want more truly than anybody else for everyone to be covered by those democratic ideals and for everybody to be awarded access to pathways to social mobility, pathways to economic justice, environmental justice, all forms of justice. That is a good person to have as a justice on the Supreme Court. Bob notes that he knows how I feel about Facebook, and he posts Holocaust memorial posts there so people won't forget. Well, thank you, Bob. That is a good service. I do applaud it. I am slightly less mad at Mark Zuckerberg than I was in previous years because of the donations he made to electoral infrastructure in 2020 to help mitigate against the sabotaging efforts of former President Donald Trump, who wanted to sabotage mail-in voting, who was taking advantage of the pandemic to try and to use his appointed Postmaster General to decommission mail sorting machines, to delay the mail, to make people's mailed-in votes, which skewed Biden because they skewed in favor of people who took COVID seriously, unlike Trump supporters who were conditioned to disregard the threat of contracting COVID from others because he told them it wasn't a big deal and that masks weren't necessary. So they were more happy to vote in person. And Trump had also told his supporters that voting by mail was inherently corrupt. So they were under instructions not to vote by mail, to disdain and despise and distrust voting by mail, and to vote in person. And then he orchestrated one prong of his coup to get Louis DeJoy to decommission over $6 different $1 million mail sorting machines to slow down the mail and make people's votes miss the voting deadline. So yes, funding from Mark Zuckerberg helped people to run the elections more smoothly, to facilitate ease of voting, which allowed for there to be a fantastic turnout from a majority of Americans, 81 million of whom voted for Joe Biden and who voted to end the despotic rule of the Putin-beholden President Trump. I got 100%, so somebody agrees with what I said. Hooray! I know there's a lot of people out there very keen to have new people appointed to the Post Office Board of Directors, because that's apparently the only mechanism by which Louis DeJoy can be ousted. But hopefully there's also criminal investigations of what he did, although industrial sabotage is probably a difficult crime to prove. And Trump is famous for avoiding paperwork and mostly just giving people instructions in person. Although famously, he called Georgia Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and in concert with his Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and his lawyer, Cleta Mitchell, in an effort to intimidate Brad Raffensperger to, as Trump said, find him 11,790 votes, which is what he needed to... it would have looked very implausible if the Secretary of State said, we just managed to find 11,790 additional votes for Trump, which means Trump now has a majority of 1 vote in the state of Georgia. He wins the state of Georgia and the electoral votes belonging to Georgia. Ophthalmologist notes placing a qualified Black woman on the Supreme Court is a terrific idea, even over the objections of Clarence Thomas. And Bob says, hey, Davina, say hi to Mr. Dav and be careful shoveling snow. Mr. Dav, Bob has bought a snowplow now. So when there's a snowstorm this weekend in Massachusetts, we're going to be able to plow our driveway without having to borrow our neighbor's plow. So that's a new development. We got petrol for it today. We've practiced using the snowplow. We're all good to go. And we're stocked up with groceries and provisions for a potential big snow-in situation. Hooray. Hooray for living in America. It's been such a great adventure so far for our family. My poor Trumpy neighbor who's unvaccinated, I send him things. I've told him Tucker Carlson's a white nationalist and that I think opposing public health measures is racist, because the initial impact of COVID, and indeed a large part of the impact, has still been on economically disadvantaged populations, in which Black Americans are disproportionately overrepresented because of the legacy and the ongoing levels of economic discrimination and economic harm that have been actively practiced by American institutions, such as the federal government excluding Black Americans from the GI returning veterans rewards program. So they weren't able to access the same loans or college benefits that white American veterans returning from World War II were able to access and build intergenerational wealth for their families with, using purchases of homes, using GI, streamlined mortgages and things. Is that what I mean? A snowblower? It's not called a snowplow? I thought it was called a snowplow. But anyway. Oh, look, we've got Donna has joined me as a listener as well. Donna, Mohammed, and someone whose name on Twitter is Black Lives Matter. There we go. We've got a few people listening through different channels. Thanks for joining me today. So what have we covered so far? We've said Putin is poised to invade Ukraine. Hopefully Germany pulls its finger out and intensifies the sanctions that it's prepared to put on the table to deter Putin. We've spoken about how Putin's drivers are not just not anything reasonable or rational, but that he wants to stop Ukraine from being a model democracy. Ukraine is improving its democracy, and Putin's opposed to that because it creates an avenue for discontent to escalate within Russia at their anti-democratic form of corrupt governance by Putin, who skims off a significant amount of profits that should go into government coffers for building up the infrastructure of Russia and thereby lifting the living standards of all Russians to different degrees. But Putin sabotages that with his program of oligarchs, and himself being the chief benefiting oligarch of Russia, with friends of his who are called Putin's wallets because they have money in their bank account that essentially belongs to Putin. They are wealthy because they're friends with Putin, and their money is essentially his money whenever he wants it. So he probably has over $200 billion. He doesn't need more money, but what he needs is to deter the Russian population from getting a dream of their own, any big ideas about democracy or functional governance. So that's sad. And then on the other hand, I've been talking about the need for white people to embrace discomfort and to avoid the comfortable passivity of ignoring injustice and ignoring increasing Republican efforts to legislate in different states around the US to make access to votes, to voting processes more difficult, particularly in majority Black communities. Rural communities are going to be underserved with polling booths in Republican-governed areas where there's Republican-controlled legislatures. 20 bills already passed last year in 2021, and there are hundreds more such bills scheduled for debate that will be passed wherever there's a Republican majority and signed by any Republican governors, because their intention is to use the cover of Trump's big lie that is quite distant. There's quite a reality gap between the truth that Trump tried to steal the results of the election using a delayed mailing processes, and to stream off his voters into voting in person, whilst the more COVID-concerned Biden voters would be more likely to avail themselves of mail-in voting because it's convenient and avoids contact with and exposure to potentially infective other people. So yes, he tried to sabotage the 2020 election, and then when he lost, more people are learning details now about how he tried to effect a coup, and that the coup had a procedural element to it, whereby his lawyer, John Eastman, who's recently been pleading the fifth over 140 times when being questioned by the January 6th committee, but whose emails are now working their way through the legislative process because various courts have ruled that he has to give up his emails to the January 6th committee. He used his university email address, so the emails are held on the university server, and they're going to give them up, but John Eastman gets to look over them first and determine which emails he wants to make privilege claims about. Now, communications with the president can be privileged if you're part of the administration, and if you're the president's lawyer, as long as the communications don't concern commission of a criminal act, as long as they're not concerned with commissioning criminal activity. And I think they're going to establish that it is criminal to seditiously try to overthrow the government and to undo the results of an election. And one final point I'd like to make is that sometimes Trumpy people, Trump and Trump associates, try and do illegal things in the open as a way of pre-establishing lack of intent. They're like, see, we didn't try to hide anything, therefore we can't be held criminally culpable for our actions, because maybe there were crimes, but we didn't know those sorts of things were crimes. And so some of what he did will always be in the open, but the January 6th committee is going to try its hardest to get to the things that he did in secret. And they were able to interview for 7 hours one of Mark Meadows' staffers. Now, Mark Meadows is a Trump loyalist who toyed with the idea of cooperating with the January 6th committee and released some of his electronic communications to them so that they were able to, Republican Liz Cheney was able to read out loud text messages from various Fox News, Fox propaganda co-hosts like Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity to Mark Meadows as Trump's chief of staff, begging him to call off the insurrectionists, the violent mob rioting at the Capitol, more than rioting, providing physical cover for those more organized element of the insurrectionists who had zip ties and weapons and were in contact with a rapid response team that were waiting in Virginia across the Potomac River that had caches of long guns and weapons that when the moment was right, they were going to be asked to bring in those weapons to assist with the overthrowing of American government. So yes, Alec Jones was in the conspiracy, Rudy Giuliani, various people who will be pleading the fifth. Alex Jones has already been boasting that he has pled the fifth. And the more we talk about it, the more interesting we make it, the more attractive we make it for white people. We need solidarity amongst decent people, and we need to bring even more white people on board, because white people are the wild card of, will they go back to voting for Republicans because Trump isn't in office? And so the threat to democracy is not as readily apparent to them. White people, relatively disengaged white people, are the wild card in the prospects of democracy in America. So we need to get them interested in what the unfolding information about the coup, and get them interested in being free, experiencing the emotional freedom of not trying to fight to hide history anymore, not trying to fight the discomfort of going, yeah, some white people have done some bad things and some white people continue to do bad things. We are not really defined that much by our racial affiliations, unless we're complicit in not speaking up. So once you're resolved to be honest, then you don't have to carry around that guilt of being complicit in a conspiracy, a fairly broadly entertained conspiracy, to hide the truth about how America profited from slavery, how America was able to rise in geopolitical significance in the world because of the incredible profitability of exploiting enslaved people, and therefore reducing overhead costs for industry by eliminating having to pay anybody for labor, and that's part of American might and American exceptionalism. So if the when the story of America becomes more honest, then you can save so much energy that you don't have to expend anymore in lying to yourself and lying to other people and writing lies in history books and then fighting the people who try and talk about the truth. Bob's still here, and Bob said, in Latin, ignorantia juris non excusat, which means apparently ignorance of the law does not excuse. Bob, our Black Lives Matter listener, Bob, gave you 100% for that observation. Ignorance of the law does not excuse, but it does create obstacles to conviction because, and Trump has often found that to be the case, because when you can't establish intent, it's much more difficult to bring about a conviction. And in fact, with a lot of tax law, ignorance of the law does prevent, it doesn't excuse, but it effectively insulates people from legal consequences. And tax law is complicated, and this provides a buffer around a lot of white-collar criminals. A lot of white-collar criminals who are more likely to be white, actually, to commit fraud with paperwork, with finances, and who evade consequences a lot of the time, particularly because the IRS is often kept in an underfunded state by Republican legislators who are able to vote on whether or not. Are you ready to go, darling?
Yep.
Okay, let's go. Well, thank you for listening, everybody. Take care. Abrupt ending, but it's been a pleasure to talk with you today, and talk again soon. Oh, my Twitter Spaces is gone. Bye. Bye, Bob. Thank you particularly for your input, and thank you, ophthalmologist, as well. Take care, everybody.